afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming along to my address this afternoon entitled The Virtues of a Law Student. Could I just get somebody to acknowledge that they can hear me? Can you put your hand up if you can hear me? Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, so thank you for coming along to my talk this afternoon called The Virtues of a Law Student. All right, so how do I succeed at the study of law? This is one of the most repeated and heartfelt questions a law student is likely to ask himself, his teachers and his classmates. Indeed, it may become more urgent with the passage of time and the accumulation of not always satisfying academic results. The answer usually takes the form of some practical tips, such as make effective notes of lectures and cases, join a study group, engage in better time management, participate more in class and so forth. And or it might take the form of some bromides like don't give up and things will improve, things of that nature. These answers can be helpful, but they don't really go to the heart of the question. Although this address is part of the teaching and learning seminar series here in the Faculty of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, I would like to start by emphasizing that I will be discussing neither teaching nor learning. I will not be discussing learning, at least not in the sense in which learning is almost always understood by those who professionally busy themselves in the ever-growing industry of educational theories. Nor will I be discussing particular techniques that students can employ in order to improve their performance in assessments. Much less will I be discussing the various supposedly scientific techniques and practices that over the last 120 years have invaded the practice of teaching in law schools and other centres of education. This has resulted in an endless parade of superficially sophisticated, temporarily fashionable, but ultimately discarded theories and practices, of which the obsession with so-called student-centered learning is just the most hardy manifestation. Indeed, student-centered learning is a theory discussed without any apparent sense of irony or self-awareness, exclusively by and among teachers, and concerns what teachers supposedly need to do in order to put students at the center of their own learning. And yet, it is still all about teaching, with students themselves positioned as the subjects and objects of an ongoing experimental process. All these failed or partly successful theories and practices ultimately emerged out of a mistaken late 19th century view of the human person as a fit and proper subject of scientific study. These and many other theories and practices in the so-called social sciences are not the product of science at all, but of a false ideology of scientism, that is, an essentially religious or superstitious belief that science and the scientific method are the only legitimate way to establish truth about all aspects of reality. Among the most articulate critics of this conceit of scientism was C.S. Lewis, who, in a literary work published at the end of the Second World War, warned of the dangers of subjecting the human person, not his body, not other aspects of humanity, but the person himself, to scientific analysis. And he remarked, quote, "You cannot study man, you can only get to know him, which is quite a different thing." This is mainly because humans are equal in their dignity by virtue of sharing a common purpose and common capacities of freedom and practical reason. The human person, therefore, has a dimension altogether beyond the realm of scientific study that no other creature shares with us. The human person is not a laboratory monkey, and it is neither permissible nor possible to study him in a similar way. Each one of us is a unique individual with a unique character, and we can only get to know each other one by one. In other words, our understanding of other people results not from a program of study, but from building individual relationships with them. This is no doubt annoying or upsetting to those who love drawing up or implementing systematic utopian plans, but the truth does not care about their feelings. Instead, I will be discussing the human person and human character. I will not be discussing what you need to do, nor will I be discussing what your professors and teachers believe they need to do to you, to do for you, or even to do with you. The classical conception of learning places neither the teacher nor the student at its center. If anything is at its center, it is the truth. It is indeed possible to speak of the classical model as truth-centered learning. Instead, I will be discussing who I believe you should strive to be in your human activity of learning the law. Not what you need to do, but who you should be in your project of studying and learning the law. My remarks today are addressed not primarily to teachers of the law, as is almost always the case in seminars such as these, but to students of the law, wherever in the world you may be. My goal is to introduce you to the oldest Western tradition of understanding the human person and exploring how this tradition can help you be a better student of the law. By revealing a tradition that has been partly submerged in the swamp of the late 19th and 20th centuries scientism, I hope that law students can begin to find within themselves a buried treasure. As the Greeks and Romans knew, all the qualities and capacities needed to excel in any endeavor lie locked within our unchanging human nature. These qualities and capacities are unlocked by the classical virtues. Before I proceed any further, I should issue three caveats or three warnings. First, as we have only a limited amount of time this afternoon, this can be nothing more than a first introduction to the classical virtues. Please regard what follows as merely the key to a door, behind which lies a huge vault stuffed full of immeasurably valuable treasures. You would be well advised to take the key, open the door, and enter the vault. Second, this is territory that I am myself still in the process of exploring. I think I have mapped the most important hills, valleys, and rivers, but I am aware that much of this new region remains for me uncharted. In these blank areas of the map, I am an unreliable guide and will refrain from taking you there. So I'll give you the second caveat again. This is territory that I'm myself still in the process of exploring. I think I've mapped the most important hills, valleys, and rivers, but I'm aware that much of this new region remains for me uncharted. In those blank areas of the map, I'm an unreliable guide and will refrain from taking you there. The third warning, I would not wish it thought that I was or regarded myself as being a particularly virtuous person. I am not. However, a doctor's advice to quit smoking remains valid, even if the doctor is himself a chain smoker. As every football coach can tell you, it is easier to know what to do than to actually do it. All right, so let's start. Before we can answer the question, how do I succeed at the study of law? We must take some steps back. We must first identify why we have embarked upon that study in the first place. In other words, we must identify the purpose or purposes we are trying to achieve. Only once we have identified the ends can we then identify the means. This will involve a brief refresher of some points I made about 1 month ago in my address titled Learning to Love the Law. This will be necessary properly to understand the context of the virtues, the context of what follows. According to Aristotle and the many influential Greeks and Romans who followed him, everything that exists has a purpose or a telos. We can tell whether and to what extent something is good by how well it fulfills its purpose. Everything has a purpose. It has a telos. Telos can be translated as purpose. And its purpose gives it its meaning. It is the goal, the end, the point of the whole thing. As law students, you may have come across the expression teleological interpretation when you're talking about statutory interpretation. You interpret something according to its meaning or according to its intention. That's basically the root of that's got the same root as it's got the root as in telos. The purpose of a house is to provide us with shelter, warmth, and comfort. And a house is good to the extent it fulfills that purpose. The purpose of food is to nourish, and it is good to the extent it fulfills its purpose, and so on. Of course, if it is true that everything has its own telos or purpose, then it must be true that our human life also has a telos or purpose. According to Aristotle and his many followers, the purpose or telos of human life is eudaimonia. Now, that's the Greek pronunciation, but as I'm an English speaker, I find that difficult, so I'm just going to call it eudaimonia, which is the way most English speakers pronounce it. This is usually translated as happiness, so that we are told in English, in English translations of Aristotle and his followers, that man's purpose or telos is happiness. That sounds too simple. How can simply happiness be our ultimate purpose or meaning of life? But happiness is a very inadequate translation of eudaimonia. So what does eudaimonia really mean? This end or purpose of life, as Aristotle would have it. To the Greeks and to the Romans, it was much more than simply happiness. It means thriving, living a complete life, or more accurately, achieving all of one's potentials, being all that one can be. The Romans rendered the idea in their native Latin in several ways, one of which was florens, which means literally flourishing, the root of the English word flower. So the idea is that eudaimonia is like a flower opening up, a bud opening up and becoming the full flower, fully flourishing. In English, the best translation of eudaimonia is probably flourishing or human flourishing. The purpose or telos of human life then is human flourishing, being all that we can be, realizing all our potentials by marshalling our talents, inclinations, and resources in order to live the most complete life we can build for ourselves in the brief time available to us. It is the achievement, in other words, of life in abundance. I've spoken about eudaimonia, of human flourishing, as the purpose of a human person's life. I've mentioned that we move closer to eudaimonia by being all that we can be, realizing our potentials by marshalling our talents, inclinations, and resources in order to live the most complete life we can build for ourselves in the time available. But how do we achieve this full human flourishing, this eudaimonia, this life in abundance? We do this in the classical tradition by participating in all the basic human goods. These goods are basic. They are not instrumental because they are not means to ends. They are the ends. They are the purpose of human life. They are not secondary goods by which we achieve our goals, like money, jobs, a house, a car, clothes, and so forth. The basic human goods are the goals, which, when participated in gradually over time, perhaps over many decades, ripen into full human flourishing, into eudaimonia. They are not things we use in our life. They are the things that make life worth living. They are the things that can bring us joy, which is probably a better translation of eudaimonia than happiness. They are the things that give our life meaning. They are the things that life is for. Many accounts, catalogues, and lists of the basic human goods have been compiled over the past 2,500 years or so. Most of them are very similar and express essentially the same ideas in different forms. My personal favorite is, and the one in which I think most succinctly and accurately frames the basic human goods, was compiled by Professor John Finnis at the University of Oxford. It consists of a list of 7 basic human goods, which, when participated in over the course of our lives, ripen into eudaimonia, into full human flourishing. These basic human goods are on the screen there now, 7 of them, there are 7. These are just headlines. The underlined words are just headlines behind which lie quite complex and extensive sets of ideas. So each one of these is just a headline, and you can participate in each one of these basic human goods in numerous, virtually infinite variety of combinations of ways of participating in these goods that will lead you to your fundamental achievement of your fundamental purpose in life, of your eudaimonia. These 7 basic ultimate and non-instrumental goods cannot be ranked or compared with each other. They are not even really separate things. So what are they? 1, life. 2, knowledge. 3, play. 4, aesthetic experience. 5, sociability or friendship. 6, religion, meaning understanding our place in the universe. And 7, practical reason, our innate freedom to choose whether and how to participate in all the basic human goods. When we participate in any of them, we are simultaneously participating to a lesser or greater extent in all the others, because they are not completely separate things. They are simply different aspects of the same thing. For law students, there are 2 of these basic human goods that are, I think, particularly relevant and in which we especially participate, and by which participation we are moving closer to the purpose of our lives, to our full human flourishing, to our eudaimonia. These 2 are the 2nd and 7th on the list: knowledge and practical reason. So first and foremost, so there are these 2 in particular, which I think are relevant to law students. First and foremost, for law students, I think of the basic human goods is this one: knowledge. The 2nd in Professor Finnis's list. To recognize knowledge as a basic human good is to recognize that knowing things about the world, including things in the world that relate to the law, is a good in itself and one of the things that make life worth living. We humans are by our very nature seekers after knowledge. Among the very first few words we learn are, when we're very young, these are the words, why, how, what, when, where. When we are very young and know almost nothing about the world, apart perhaps from the faces of our parents, and as soon as we start to speak, we are always using these words to the point of testing the patience of the adults around us. We are like little sponges soaking up knowledge about the world and having a wonderful time participating in this basic, non-instrumental human good. The evidence that knowledge is a basic human good, a good in itself, even when it is not useful as a means of acquiring some other good, is all around us. We watch and listen to documentaries and read articles and books on myriad subjects, from astronomy to zoology, that can be of no possible use to us, except to satisfy our curiosity to know more about the universe in which we live. Indeed, to deny that knowledge is a basic human good, to deny that is to engage in an act of self-parody. If you really did believe that knowledge is not a good in itself, a basic good, why would you bother to argue the point with me? At law school, we continue a lifelong participation in this basic human good by learning more and more about the law and related topics, and experiencing the pleasurable satisfaction of grasping ideas and concepts that perhaps initially escaped our understanding. I often see this for myself in the surprised and happy facial expressions of students when the penny drops and a difficult proposition is suddenly illuminated by the rays of understanding. Indeed, I sometimes experience the pleasure for myself in the law library after rereading a difficult passage for perhaps the second or third time before finally getting the author's point. This experience of pleasure and even occasional delight has nothing to do with acquiring knowledge for some instrumental purpose. It is a basic human good, an end in itself, and a contributor to our full human flourishing. It's the sort of thing we mean when we say, after participating in any of the basic human goods, not just knowledge, after we participate in any of them, it's a thing we mean when we say something like, that made my day. We've all said that at some point. But knowledge is not only a basic human good. It can also be, and is probably much more often, a secondary or instrumental good. In other words, it can be like money or a car, a good that allows us to acquire other goods with the ultimate purpose of participating in the basic goods and moving closer to our full human flourishing. So, we may study contract law, either for its own sake, as a mode of participating in the basic human good of knowledge, or, as I'm afraid to say is much more likely, we may study it as a means to obtaining some other secondary goods, such as a passing grade in the course, and then a law degree, and then a license to practice law, and then a career in the law, and the acquisition of money, lots and lots of money. All these things are connected secondary goods that allow us opportunities for participation in all the basic human goods. But even when we pursue the knowledge of law merely as a secondary good, we cannot avoid simultaneously participating in the basic human good of knowledge. Indeed, the more effective we are at the study of law as a secondary good, as a means to something else, the more likely we will begin to experience that study as participation in the basic human good of knowledge. The other basic human good that is particularly relevant for law students is the good of practical reason. That's the seventh and last on Professor Finnis's list. Knowledge is relevant to all students, number 2, but number 7 has a particular relevance for law students. Practical reason, what is the basic human good of practical reason? Practical reason is what steers us in the ways we participate in our full human flourishing. It's like the bridge of the ship where the captain is located and where decisions are made about how to navigate the ship and which ports are to be the destination of the ship. This is the faculty and basic human good that directs us to all the other basic goods in freedom. This is unique to humans and is the faculty which gives us our freedom and our innate freedom as human beings. We say something is reasonable to the extent that it is in accordance with practical reason. That is, to the extent that it is good for us by moving us or other people closer to our eudaimonia, closer to our full human flourishing. Whereas knowledge is the basic human good in which all students, and not only law students especially, participate, the basic human good of practical reason provides a special niche for students of the law. This is particularly true of students of the common law. Everywhere in the common law, we meet the quote unquote reasonable man or the reasonable person, the ideal person who exercises his practical reason objectively well in particular sets of circumstances. At first, when the ideal reasonable person is still new to us, we struggle with confusion and uncertainty as to who this person is and what he or she would do in the circumstances we are considering. I'm encountering this now with my first year students in contract law. This is something which they are only gradually now, bit by bit, week by week, coming to grips with. As time goes by, and as we accumulate experience of legal studies, of the common law, and of life itself, we grow more accustomed to and skillful at making assessments as to what the ideal reasonable person would think and do. The same is true, and perhaps more so, when we switch our focus from the common law to equity. A word frequently used as a synonym for inequitable is unconscionable. Sometimes that's a word that's used to describe inequitable behavior is unconscionable behavior. Equity is indeed a jurisdiction of conscience, as has been said many times. If conduct is contrary to good conscience, even if it is strictly lawful, we can anticipate that equity might take an interest in it. Our practical reason allows us to decide, choose, and act in ways that move us closer to our full human flourishing, to our eudaimonia. When we are acting reasonably, we are acting morally. Immoral conduct is quite literally unreasonable because it impedes our ability to achieve full human flourishing for ourselves or for others. If conduct is unreasonable, it is immoral. And if it is immoral, it is contrary to our conscience. Unreasonable conduct is therefore literally unconscionable and contrary to the requirements of equity. So, as with the common law, our study of equity allows law students to participate in the basic human goods or practical reason, the basic human good of practical reason in a special way. These are gifts the study of law confers on those students who are open to receive them. This now that we've surveyed this territory, this allows us to return to the question of how we can be better students of the law, how we can become more effective as law students, more dedicated and committed and excellent at legal studies. According to Aristotle and those many others who worked in and developed the classical tradition, all the qualities and capacities needed to excel in any natural endeavor lie locked within our unchanging human nature, our natura, according to the Romans, our phusis, according to the Greeks, our unchanging human nature. These qualities are unlocked by the classical virtues. In Latin, the word for virtue is, well, we would pronounce it virtus. The Romans would have pronounced it virtus. That's how they would have actually pronounced that word that you can see on the screen, Latin virtus, meaning in Latin, literally, manliness. That's actually literally what it means, because vir, via or vir, is the Latin word for man. So virtus or virtus is manliness. However, the Roman understanding was, like most aspects of high Roman culture, borrowed or adapted from the Greeks. The Romans conquered Greece in the 2nd century BC, but as the great Roman poet Horace acknowledged, quote, I'm quoting from Horace, the great Roman poet, quote, "Captive Greece took captive her savage conquerors and brought her arts to the Latin rustics, the Latin country bumpkins," unquote. The Romans conquered the lands of the Greeks, but the Greeks then conquered the minds of the Romans. The Roman armies in Greece provided their city not only with impressive military victories, but also with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and battalions of other Greek philosophers, poets, scientists, historians, and artists. The Greek word for virtue, which is what the Romans brought back with them from Greece, and which they translated as virtus or virtus, which is the source of our English word virtue. The Greek word for virtue is arete, which literally means excellence, or more precisely, moral excellence. The military-minded Romans regarded manliness as an adequate virtus, or manliness, as an adequate translation of the Greek ideal. But we can grasp that the Greek word is much broader in meaning than the inadequate Latin translation. According to Aristotle and those working in the classical tradition, a virtue, an arete, is a quality that assists us to perform excellently in the performance of some kind of good activity, in the attainment of some basic or secondary human good. Aristotle says that a virtue is a human excellence that helps us to, quote, this is a quote from Aristotle, helps us to, quote, live, think, and do well. Live, think, and do well, unquote. In order to rise to the level of a virtue, the quality must be stable across an extended period of time. A single act of giving money to a beggar, for instance, is a good act, but is not considered virtuous. In other words, virtues are established, ingrained habits that assist us to achieve some basic or secondary human good. How do we develop such habits? In the same way that we develop any habit, by practice and repetition until it becomes a virtually automatic part of our nature with little or no need of conscious effort. How do we become virtuous at playing a piano? By repetition and practice until our fingers seem to have a life of their own. It is little wonder that we call a brilliant pianist or violinist a virtuoso, which is an Italian word meaning a virtuous person. That's what it means. The virtuoso has become virtuous because he has developed the habit or practice of playing his instrument well. How do we become excellent at physical exercise? Again, by repetition and practice until we feel that something is wrong, something is missing if we don't go out and exercise. Playing the piano and physical exercise are both a participation in one or several basic human goods, and might also be a participation in one or more secondary human goods. For example, if we're getting paid money to do it. Any habit that helps us excel at the attainment of these goods is a virtue. There are literally scores, perhaps hundreds of virtues. Most of them are specific to a particular activity or a narrow range of activities. For instance, you may have heard it said that patience is a virtue. That's a very common saying, patience is a virtue. That will almost always be true, for instance, for the mother of young children, but will certainly not be true for a pilot trying to pull his aircraft out of a nosedive. This is not one of the basic virtues. This is a secondary virtue. Although most virtues are limited in, almost all virtues are limited in their circumstances of application, the classical tradition of Aristotle and many others recognize that there are 4 virtues that are always required in every situation and which are the source of all the other more specific or particular virtues. These virtues are, here they are on the screen with their Greek and Latin words that are associated with these English. So this is on the left underlined, you see the English translation of the Greek and Latin virtues, cardinal virtues. So there are 4 of them. Courage, sometimes in English called fortitude, which comes from the Latin fortitudo. Actually, the Greek word for courage is andreia, which again literally means manliness. So in the Greek world, courage was thought to be more particularly associated with men than with women, although the Greeks themselves explained that there was a particular form of courage that was also manifested particularly by women. But the general word for courage was andreia in Greek. Courage, justice, justitia in Latin, temperance, temperentia in Latin, and prudence, or wisdom or discernment, which is prudentia in Latin, or sophia in Greek. In the classical tradition, these are the 4 cardinal virtues. Cardo, they come from the Latin word cardo. Cardo is the Latin word meaning hinge, like the hinge on a door. And the idea is that these 4 are the virtues upon which all the other virtues are hinged, or on which they turn. According to the great Roman lawyer, philosopher and statesman Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, it was the way he would have pronounced his own name. We call him Cicero. According to Cicero, all good action springs ultimately from the cardinal virtues, and all the subsidiary virtues are more specific manifestations of one or more of the cardinal virtues. The mother's patience, for instance, is a subsidiary manifestation of both prudence and temperance, while the pilot's emergency decisiveness is a subsidiary manifestation of both prudence and courage. How can the cardinal virtues help us to achieve our full potential as students of the law? Let us take them one at a time. In each case, I will also make one suggestion, because of time, only one, make one suggestion for a subsidiary virtue of that cardinal virtue that appears to be particularly relevant for law students. Let's start with courage. It's number 1 on the list there on the screen. Courage, or fortitude, is the cardinal virtue that assists us to overcome the emotion of fear. This virtue has unfortunately become more necessary in recent times, and your teachers do not always set a good example. Our fears result from an external threat of some sort, which has the potential to endanger our safety in some way. This could be a threat to our physical safety, but it could also be a threat to our financial security, or simply to our physical or emotional comfort. Fear of embarrassment. Now, those of you who are law students know where I'm going now. Fear of embarrassment is something I witness almost every time I teach a class in Hong Kong. Far too many students fear embarrassment by answering questions or simply by speaking up, for fear that their answer or contribution will expose the limits of their understanding. Aristotle said that a person who habitually and unreasonably allows his fears to master him is quite properly called a coward. Cowardice is a vice, that is, a habit that is the opposite of the virtue of courage, a habit that moves us further away from the basic and secondary human goods and from our human flourishing. In order to overcome our literally unreasonable fears of embarrassment, we need to develop good habits, that is, virtues, that fall under the umbrella of the cardinal virtue of courage. One of these subsidiary virtues, it's a virtue, self-confidence. That is a virtue, a subsidiary virtue under the cardinal virtue of courage. As with all virtues, this can be developed only with practice. Practice self-confidence, and over time, you will become self-confident. It will become your second nature. A law student who has failed to develop the virtue of self-confidence, the subsidiary virtue of self-confidence, is limiting his own potential for an excellent participation in the various basic and secondary goods that law school can provide, and cramping his own potential for full human flourishing. Life is short. Law school is shorter. Don't waste your opportunities by being a coward. Let's turn our attention now to the second cardinal virtue on the list, justice. Justice is the cardinal virtue that assists you to give every person, including yourself, what is reasonably due to them. That's what it is. Give every person, including yourself, give every person his due. This cardinal virtue has three dimensions to it: legal justice, commutative justice, and distributive justice. For reasons of time, I will confine my comments to legal justice and commutative justice. Legal justice is, at least for our purposes today, the simplest form of justice. As I'm addressing law students, I should make a few remarks about this form of cardinal virtue. Were you a different audience, were you students in some other subject, I would probably pass over legal justice in an address about how to be a better student generally. Practical reason requires that we must obey the state's laws, provided they meet the minimum requirements of a fully valid law. This will ordinarily be the case for the vast majority of the state's laws. A just law, a law that commands our respect in reason and conscience, is a law that is made for the common good. Such a law, by definition, gives each person, by definition, such a law gives each person his due. If it's a just law, everyone is getting their due. Unjust laws, by contrast, have no call on our practical reason, on our conscience. A law can fail to be made for the common good if it was enacted for the purpose of preserving the power or riches of a ruling party, a ruling class, or a ruling race. In such circumstances, according to this classical tradition, the supposed law is quite literally unreasonable, and the cardinal virtue of justice would not be engaged in a way requiring our obedience. I had a bit more to say about this in my previous address, Learning to Love the Law. In certain very narrow and highly exceptional circumstances, justice might actually compel our defiance of the law, but those are very rare and very exceptional circumstances. Commutative justice, that's sort of legal justice. We got that out of the way because you're law students. I thought I should say something about that. Commutative justice is, I think, more relevant, however, for today's purposes. To act with commutative justice is to give another person that which is owed to him as an individual person deserving of respect. For instance, you should honour your debts to others as they should honour their debts to you. How can cultivating the virtue of justice in its commutative dimension help you become a better law student? There are a number of answers to this question, but for today's purposes, let me zoom in on just one of them. I want to focus on the subsidiary, so it's subsidiary to justice, the subsidiary virtue of gratitude. Gratitude is a subsidiary virtue. It's under commutative justice. The virtue of gratitude derives from the cardinal virtues mainly of justice, but also of practical reason, wisdom. Someone is paying to send you to law school. For most of you, that will be your parents. Were you to be acting in accordance with the habit or virtue of gratitude, you would be making sure that their sacrifices on your behalf, and not only their financial sacrifices, are not wasted. You would be acting habitually every day in a grateful way, honouring their investments, financial, intellectual, and emotional, in your human flourishing. You owe them you owe them this as individual persons worthy of respect. Even if your parents are not paying, someone is. If you are married, your spouse is sacrificing money, opportunities, time, and your company to speed you on your way to your law degree and your flourishing. In studying at law school, you should conduct yourself with the habit or virtue of gratitude in order to ensure that their sacrifices are not squandered. They, like you, have only one natural life. So let's now move to the third item on the list, the cardinal virtue of temperance or moderation. If the cardinal virtue of courage protects us from the emotion of fear generated by external threats, the cardinal virtue of temperance or moderation protects us from internal threats posed by other emotions and appetites. Anger is one such emotion. It is no accident that a person who succumbs to the emotion of anger is said to have lost his temper. This comes from temperance. The person loses his temper, he's angry. Likewise, the temperance movement, there was the once very, very formidable social movement, right? The temperance movement that sought to ban liquor arose in response to the inability of many people to control their appetites. Remember, it's about controlling emotions and appetites. The temperance movement arose in response to the inability of many people, too many people at one point, to control their appetites for alcohol. These various emotions and appetites can, like fear, frustrate us from participating in the human goods, including those available to us at law school. As the virtue's alternative name, moderation, suggests, it causes us to act moderately in relation to our emotions and appetites. We can cultivate this virtue to our profit as law students by habitually refraining from getting too much or too little sleep, eating too much or too little food, socializing with friends too much or too little, because we need our friends, refraining from too much alcohol consumption, and so forth. In other words, we need, with the aid of the virtue of prudence, to strike a balance between too much and too little in relation to our emotions and appetites, leaving us fully able intellectually, emotionally, and physically to learn the law and move closer to our full human flourishing. As this moderation becomes a habit, it becomes increasingly effortless and almost instinctive. But without practice, our destructive emotions, such as anger, resentment, dejection, depression, hatred, and our appetites for food, intoxicants like drugs and alcohol, and sex, will veer towards the immoderate if we don't have an eye on them. They will veer naturally towards the immoderate with an increasing tendency to damage your potential at law school and for your longer term human flourishing. Now we'll turn our attention to the last of these, number 4. I have left the most important of the cardinal virtues until last. Prudence or wisdom or discernment is the cardinal virtue that corresponds most directly to the basic human good of practical reason. They very substantially overlap. Indeed, prudence or wisdom is what you get when you have fully participated skillfully over a long period of time and habitually in the basic human good of practical reason, of choosing well, which human goods to participate in and how to participate in. Just as practical reason directs us to the ways we participate in all the basic human goods, so prudence or wisdom directs us in how we practice the other virtues. For instance, I counseled courage and self-confidence in participating in class. Prudence will tell you when you know enough about the subject that you will not actually waste your classmates' and teachers' time with a pointless intervention. Courage does not imply recklessness. I told you that justice requires gratitude for the sacrifices of others. Prudence tells you whether and how much you owe and what precisely would be an appropriate way of acting with gratitude in any given situation. I suggested that moderation would cause you to not spend too much or too little time socializing with friends, but how much is too much and how little is too little. This too falls to be determined by the cardinal virtue of prudence or wisdom. You can see, I hope, the critical role this cardinal virtue plays in practicing all the virtues. But prudence or wisdom or discernment is special for another reason. It is the only intellectual virtue. The others are sometimes called ethical or moral virtues. This one is ethical and moral and also intellectual. In this capacity, the cardinal virtue helps the pursuit of truth and the avoidance of error. There are a number of subordinate intellectual virtues, including, for example, intellectual honesty, intellectual open-mindedness, intellectual courage, and intellectual charity. But for law students, especially for our law students, I think the most important of the subordinate intellectual virtues is the virtue of intellectual curiosity. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates remarks that the love of wisdom starts with wonder and puzzlement. Indeed, he says that wisdom has no starting point apart from wonder and puzzlement. Aristotle remarks that the wise person is bothered by the fact that he does not know something about a perplexing topic. This is the source of the virtue of intellectual curiosity. Were you actually bothered or irritated by your lack of understanding of some doctrine of contract law? If you weren't, you would have been less motivated to cure your ignorance and done only enough, or what you thought was enough, to prepare for the test or the exam. Only those students who have cultivated a habit of digging deeply in order to uncover the truth for its own sake, only those students have acquired the virtue of intellectual curiosity. This hunger to know more about the law for its own sake is indeed a sign that you have already made the law your friend and that you are on your way to being a great law student and a great lawyer. Now we reach the end. My goal today was to introduce you to some aspects of your own human nature about which you were perhaps not fully aware. These were once very well known, but our vision has been obscured over the past 120 years or so by the rise of a scientistic, not scientific, view of the human person. However, because the classical virtues are actually part of our unchanging human nature, we can find and cultivate them even without being fully aware of their existence, in much the same way that a man in a pitch dark room might occasionally stumble upon things that are in that room. But our knowledge of the virtues is like a flashlight that illuminates the room and allows us to identify and more effectively grasp the things that we need in order to achieve our purpose at law school and in life. thank you all very much for your attendance and your attention this afternoon. I'm very grateful that you have given me something useful to do. Good luck in your studies and in your professional lives and in your lives together. Thank you so much.